Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. If you like what you hear, I would definitely appreciate you leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Now, let me quickly mention we are on Patreon. There's 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, which represent the 4 traditional patriarchies of Christianity. The biggest thing to joining us on Patreon is you help support the show and keep this whole operation going, but you also get inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs. You get bonus audio, video content, and Pope Coin coming soon, monthly book drawings, early content, ad-free content, and more. For as little as a thin dime a day, you can join the list. For as little as 50 cents a day, you can reach the highest prestige, that of the Pope of Rome. And don't forget, you'll be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. You want to join early so your name is on the top of that list. So now let us quickly commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and David at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Today we're continuing our Summer of Scholars series, even though we're starting to enter fall in the Northern Hemisphere at least. Today I'm joined by a scholar and fellow collaborator, podcaster, host of the History of North America podcast, Mark Vinet. And we're going to talk about the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a really important event that was involved the popes of Rome and all the politics and power that you just love about the Renaissance and the age of exploration. I think you're really going to enjoy this show because it's a really deep dive into history, politics, commerce, economics, and all of this will really help you get to learn a little bit more about the History of North America podcast with Mark Vinet. That's a fascinating podcast. You can learn more about Mark's podcast by going to markvinet.com or in the show notes. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If you have questions, please feel free to email me or Mark, and you'll definitely be hearing more from Mark Vinet and his History of North America podcast and more. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll talk to you soon.
Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinet. In this special crossover episode, join me and Steve Guerra of History of the Papacy podcast as we turn back the clock to 1494 and examine the Treaty of Tordesillas, sanctioned by Pope Julius II, which divided newly explored territories, including North America, between Portugal and Spain. But first, allow me to introduce myself to Steve's audience. My History of North America podcast and videocast presents in a positive manner the sweeping saga of the continent from its deep history origins to our present epoch. For the purposes of my series, I define North America to include the USA, Canada, and Mexico. I explore the interesting, compelling, inspiring, and tragic stories of these 3 great nations, their inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, and respective geographies. My goal is to search for the multiple causes that led to the thrilling story of North America, an action-packed tale that's still unfolding. I voyage back to earlier times and investigate incidents that set in motion a series of events that help explain the close, yet sometimes contentious relationship of these 3 continental neighbors. The United States, Mexico, and Canada have many important features and attributes in common. It's not surprising, therefore, that the history of the exploration and subsequent settlement of these 3 countries are closely interrelated. The complete history of these 3 nations cannot be properly analyzed and understood without reference to the history of the other. Part of this saga brings us today to the consequential and controversial Treaty of Tordesillas. But before we take a deep dive into this far-reaching accord, Steve, would you like to tell my audience about your podcast?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I want to thank you so much, Mark, for having me on your show today and for proposing this crossover episode. It's a really fascinating history, and it leads a lot into the history that I discuss in my podcast. Well, my name is Steve Guerra, and I'm the host of the History of the Papacy podcast. It's a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian church, and we start at the beginning, but we don't necessarily take a straight line. And that's why episodes like this are really fascinating for me, because I'm able to discuss a lot of the history and theology and all of the background story that makes the time period that happened before things like the Treaty of Tordesillas make more sense. And it illuminates and illumines some of the history that came afterwards. So I love these types of episodes.
Here is a short synopsis of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Signed at Tordesillas in Spain on June 7, 1494, this agreement divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between the Portuguese and Spanish empires. The dividing line of demarcation was about halfway between Portugal's Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa and the islands explored by Christopher Columbus on his first voyage in 1492, which were claimed for Spain. The lands to the east would belong to Portugal and the lands to the west to Spain. Steve, what is the background of this treaty up to the year 1493?
It's a really complicated story, and there's a lot of twists and turns. Really, at the heart of this issue is a major dynastic fight that happened in the Iberian Peninsula, what we would today call modern day Spain and Portugal. In the late 1400s, there was really no such thing as Spain per se. Portugal was an independent kingdom with more or less the same borders that we would see on the map today. Now, the complicated story between these kingdoms and the Iberian Peninsula, it's really worth taking a quick look at this backstory, especially the fights between the royal families and this conflict, because that's a large driver of the story. And if you want to know even more about all the complications in this, there's a book called 1494 by Stephen R. Bown, which will give you a lot more background information between this really fun and complicated struggle. But in short, what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s was the kingdom that would become Spain was three kingdoms and emirate. There was the Kingdom of Castile, which was most of the central and northern part of the peninsula. Then you had the Kingdom of Aragon, which was most of the east coast. A small kingdom of Navarre, which was lodged in the Pyrenees in between France and Spain. And that included part of the Basque country. Then you had the Emirate of Granada, which was the last Muslim outpost in the Iberian Peninsula, which was located in the high Sierra Nevada mountains in the south of Spain. The name Sierra Nevada means snowy mountains, and you wouldn't think that in one of the hottest part of Spain you'd still have snowy mountains. It's that these mountains are almost impenetrable. So the royalty of all these kingdoms intermarried all the time, trying to tie the whole peninsula together. Now, in the time leading up to the 1490s and 1480s, Castile, this main central kingdom, was ruled by a weak king named Enrique. He had major problems producing an heir that the aristocracy of Castile would support and approve of. There was a lad named Alfonso who was technically next in line, but he was not the direct heir of Enrique, and Enrique really wanted a direct heir. Enrique had a sister named Isabella, who also had a claim to the crown as well. And the whole idea of primogeniture, where sons had to be the next in line for the kingdom, was not as locked in Spain and Portugal as it was in, say, like England at that time.
Interesting.
Now, Enrique did everything he could to get his daughter as the next in line. Her name was Juana, but she didn't have much support, and there was a lot of rumors going around that she wasn't even Enrique's daughter. And that's a whole different story that we really don't need to talk about. But if you're interested in, there's that involved a lot of really fascinating intrigues, but it doesn't really pertain much to what we are talking about today. Now, Enrique, he wanted to marry off Isabella for a variety of reasons. There was some talk about her marrying a really high member of the French court and some other nobles, but none of these really went anywhere for a variety of reasons. Now, Isabella, she was a teen at this time, and as teens are wont to do, she found maybe what I call the quote unquote captain of the football team to marry. And that was a fellow named Ferdinand, the next in line to be the king of the kingdom of Aragon, next door to Castile.
I have a hard time imagining Queen Isabella as a young teenage princess, because our image of her in all the paintings and in the history that is often told is of a very mature, strong, powerful woman.
It's so funny too. And before reading this and really digging into the history, that's what I had in my mind. But then as we see later how Ferdinand and Isabella, they were married when they were about, I believe Ferdinand was about 17 and Isabella was a little bit younger than that. So they came up together and really grew into adults with each other, into this powerful power couple that we'll see in the 1490s. It's a really fascinating character arc for them. It really is Ferdinand and Isabella. It's hard to separate the two.
And I think that Queen Isabella even had a military side to her as she got older. She became a queen that would actually go onto the battlefields. Maybe you can just give us a word or two on the Reconquista period. That's what we're living in at this point, where these various kingdoms are trying to reunite Spain by kicking out or conquering the Muslims that occupy the southern part of the peninsula.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating part of the story. The Muslims had conquered almost all of the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD, so about 700 years, over 700 years previous to this point we're talking about in the 780s. So at that point, all of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Visigoths. Slowly over the centuries, bands of the Visigoths started to reconquer parts of the Iberian Peninsula. And they formed various kingdoms, the kingdom of Leon, there's a kingdom of Asturias. But out of that mix, these kingdoms of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon are the ones that formed the nucleus, and they were the ones that became the most powerful kingdom, along with Navarre. Navarre grew and shrank over time, and it really doesn't play into our story today. In about the 1200s, almost all of the peninsula had been taken back except for the very extreme south, which would become the Emirate of Granada. By about the end of the 1200s, Portugal had been reconquered in almost its a shape that it has today. And it took a long time for that last holdout kingdom to be reconquered. And it was really Isabella and Ferdinand who were the ones who put together the last campaign to conquer Granada. That is what kickstarted Spain, or what we could really call Castile and Aragon, to get into the voyage of discovery game that Portugal had been very heavily invested in for the past few decades of the 1400s.
Although Portugal hadn't been sailing west, as Columbus eventually did, they'd been sailing south and trying to explore the African coast and go around the continent, and they eventually did, in order to reach Asia.
Yeah, which that's a key part that's going to play into the whole story of the Treaty of Tordesillas and some of the treaties that led up to the Treaty of Tordesillas.
The key year in all this, Steve, is 1492, and that's perhaps one of the key years in all of human history, because we've got the age of discovery that's gaining momentum. We've got Spain, well, the different kingdoms of the peninsula that would eventually become a united Spain, conquering Granada and basically realizing their dream of the Reconquista. We've got Christopher Columbus sailing west. We've got the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and we've got the Inquisition.
Now, Ferdinand and Isabella, one of the suitors that they had talked about her marrying was, he's in Portuguese, his name is João II. In English, we call him King John II of Portugal. I like João better myself, so I'm going to call him João or John. Either, well, I'll probably flip between the two. But so John is about the same age of Ferdinand and Isabella. Enrique, one of his thoughts was marry off Isabella to John so that they can unite Portugal and Castile a little bit more. But when she marries Ferdinand of Aragon, that's what's going to cement together what we call Spain. So it was really Castile had the choice. They could look together to cement Castile with Portugal, or they could cement Aragon with Castile. And that would have been a really major change in history, which one they got cemented with. It's just so it happens that Ferdinand and Isabella get married. Enrique was never able to get enough support for his daughter to become his heir to the throne of Castile. Enrique dies a horrible death. Alfonso, who's technically the next in line, he dies. Well, here we go. We have Isabella. She becomes the Queen of Castile. She's married to the King of Aragon, and we have this joint kingdom now. And with them getting married, there's a major event that happens, and there is the large battle between John of Portugal. He wasn't leading the army, his father was leading the army, but they attack Castile, and Ferdinand wipes the floor with Portugal in that battle. And that really cements Ferdinand as he's to use that analogy, he's the captain of the football team. He is the man. That really sets the tone for the relationship between Castile and Aragon and Portugal for the next 20 odd years after that Portugal is really not looking forward to getting into a military conflict with Castile and Aragon. And that plays into a lot of the politics that happen between these two kingdoms.
So in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, on behalf of Spain, sponsor Columbus's voyage west. And it's because of Columbus's new explorations that other countries get involved, the papacy get involved, and they want to try and sort all of this out.
And there's one event that happens that's really the massive Kickstarter for why Portugal and Spain feel the need to go exploring. They had explored some, and some of that exploring was kind of leftover impetus from the Reconquista. They did some exploring of these islands that are in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, like the Canary Islands and the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores. They had done some exploring of them, but the real impetus to really find out what was going on out there was the fall of Constantinople, which was only 40 years, less than 40 years. Or wait, no, let me do my math here.
1453?
1450. Oh, yeah, so I got it right. Okay.
Your math is good, Steve. Your math is good.
So that was less than 40 years before 1492 and Columbus setting off. What the significance of the fall of Constantinople was the spice trade, which was the reason Portugal was trying to inch its way around Africa. They're desperately looking for what was called the Spice Islands and the Indies, which they didn't have a great idea what these places were all about, but they knew that this is the place where they got pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, all these really key and important spices in Europe. That's where they were getting from. They were coming through Constantinople to Venice and the Italian states. They were outrageously expensive. They were worth their weight in gold or more because they had to be somehow traded between modern day India and Indonesia and make their way through to Europe. And they would go through many, many, many middlemen to get to Europe. Now, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks really put a strangle on the spice trade. They weren't trading a ton of spices spices, and the spices that they were trading, they were selling at even more outrageous prices. It's hard to find an analogy in the modern day of a commodity that was so critical to people's lives being cut off. And these commodities are coming from somewhere. But how do you find them? This time period between the 1450s and the 1490s is when Europeans, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, really start trying to figure out how can we get these spices directly from the source. And now a word from our sponsors.
Let me try and make an analogy with the oil and gas crisis of the 1970s. Oil and gas had always been very cheap to obtain, easy to obtain, plentiful. And then in the 1970s, there was a crisis where basically it was cut off and there was a stranglehold of the product itself. That began a whole new wave of research and exploration here on the continent in North America, so that one day, decades later, North America basically has become energy independent. So you can make that analogy with Constantinople that fell in 1453, and now European countries have to slowly look for alternative ways of reaching Asia. And one of them was exploring down the coast of Africa, as we've mentioned, and finally reaching the tip of Africa. I think it was in 1488.
Yeah.
And this was a legacy of Prince John the Navigator and his whole system of encouraging Portuguese sailors and technology in order to do so. Explorers round the tip of Africa in 1488, and Columbus, only 4 years later, sails west.
Yeah, and so that conquest of Constantinople, that did a few things. So it really did three things that impacted directly the need for these voyages of discovery. It cut off the spice trade. It put a bunch of really great Italian cartographers, navigators, and sailors out of jobs. These people knew how to manage ships. They knew everything about sailing and how to navigate. They're out of work. They're ready to go work for Portugal and Spain. And the last thing that happened was it pushed out a lot of the Greek scholars of Constantinople who knew a lot about ancient cartography and ancient theories on things such as the size of the earth and how to navigate longitude and understanding latitude. A lot of times in the common culture, we talk about how Arabs, they were the ones who preserved Greek knowledge. We had the Greeks who were living in Constantinople. They had this knowledge, and they went to Italy and they went to the various courts in Europe. Even though Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire had been on a very long, slow decline, a lot of learning still happened in Constantinople. Now these scholars don't have a place to go. They go to Italy, they go to France, they go to Spain, they go to John the Navigator's court, and they have just vast amounts of knowledge that they're going to share. And this knowledge really changes not just the topic today of the discovery of the Americas and the discovery of eventual route around Africa. They do a lot of other things that are really interesting that I talked about in my podcast. So all these ingredients are in there, especially the fall of Granada. Like we had talked about, Portugal they were doing a lot of exploring. Spain, not so much. But now with the fall of Granada, it gave them, between that and the fall of Constantinople, it gave Castile and Aragon the boost of the technology that they needed to go on their discoveries. It also gave them the extremely tough warriors who had built up over the course of hundreds of years of fighting. They knew how to drive wedges in communities based on the way they had fought this Reconquista of just moving the line south a little bit after each generation. These medieval institutions also gave Spain a jump start on how to colonize. They had really perfected these institutions. So Spain was ready to go right after the fall of Granada in 1492. That's when it happened. And they are ready to set forth on their own voyages of discovery.
It's now the eve of 1494. Spain has entered the discovery game. Portugal has been there for a while, and now both countries who are competing want to sort things out. What is a papal bull?
A papal bull is a really important document in the Middle Ages. A papal bull is an official declaration by the Pope. Bull comes from a Latin word bulla, which refers to the official leaden seal placed on the document. Bulls were issued for all sorts of things and were really quite common up until the last 100 years or so. But when the Pope issued a bull, that was serious. And I think that's what our audience should get out of the bull. And you don't need to know all the ins and outs, but a bull was serious business. And following the bull was...
Could you compare it to an executive order by the President of the United States?
That plus, so that temporal action, but there's also usually a spiritual action involved with that as well. So if you don't follow a papal bull, you could get excommunicated for it. So it's like a presidential executive order plus.
So your soul was also at risk.
Yes, absolutely. And so whenever we're talking about the Middle Ages, that is a key consideration when people act.
So leading up to the treaty, there are some papal bulls that are signed.
Yes, those papal bulls are in a way more important than the treaty themselves because they're what gives action to those treaties.
Who was Pope Alexander VI?
He is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire history of the popes of Rome and Christian church. And I could go on about him for hours. He's the greatest Renaissance pope, in my opinion, but you could put him in a top list of almost any category you want in popes. But more importantly for us today is that Alexander VI, that was his name he took upon becoming pope. What he went by in Italy was Rodrigo Borgia. He was born in the kingdom of Aragon, and his real name was Rodrigo de Borja. He was an Aragonese nobleman from around the area of Valencia, as they would say it now. And then his name was italicized as Borgia because he had lived in Italy for so long and was so intricately involved in Italian politics. What's interesting is Borgia at that time, he was really close personally to Isabella and Ferdinand. He knew them since they were teenagers, and he's in large part what allowed to get them married. He was the one who pushed that through politically and made that happen, even though the King of Castile, Enrique, wasn't super happy about it, and they really shouldn't have gotten married. He was the one who smoothed over a lot of things and actually got permission from the Pope at that time for that to happen. So that connection to Isabella and Ferdinand plays a critical role in our story today about the various treaties and papal bulls that happen. It just so happens that Ferdinand and Isabella are so faithful to Alexander VI and so have such a strong relationship with him. They make his son Juan, also known as Giovanni, an important noble as the Duke of Gandia in Aragon. And then a later son takes over in that role. He's killed, and there's a lot of killing in this time period. But eventually the Borgias and the Borjas, they will be these dukes of Gandia for many, many centuries. A fun fact is Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgias, his uncle was a pope, and then a later descendant through his son, who was the Duke of Gandia, would become a Jesuit saint of the church.
So Pope Alexander is responsible for signing a papal bull or several leading up to the actual Treaty of 1494?
The papal bulls and the documents that come out in 1494, there's a bit of context before that. There's a papal bull that was signed in 1455 called Romanus Pontifex. A lot of these names of the papal bulls the title has really nothing directly to the content. So if you know Latin or you know something about bulls and later papal encyclicals, the title won't give you any clue to what the content of the document is. But anyways, this bull from 1455 gave the Portuguese monopoly rights of first discovery to everything up to the Cape of Bahador on the African coast. That's just south of the modern nation of Morocco and the Canary Islands. So it's not terribly far down the African coast. And that shows you how small their discoveries were at this point, or how limited. Now, 1456, then another pope, Pope Calixtus, reaffirmed those rights and extended it to all along the African coast. So he's kind of giving them, the Portuguese, full range. Whatever you find along this African coast is yours to exploit. There's some controversy, and we need to speak about this, is about slavery in these papal bulls. And slavery has always been a highly controversial issue. Obviously, it is. The Castilians and the Genoese, they really wanted to push the boundaries on all of these bulls. Slavery was actually a really lucrative part of the Portuguese African trade that they had. They traded spices and that sort of thing, but they were also really interested in getting slaves out of these new parts of Africa. That was another way. They wanted to cut out the Arab emirs of North Africa out of the slave trade. They were really the Arab emirates of North Africa were the key linchpin in the slave trade at that time. So the Portuguese wanted to kind of cut them out of the slave trade, but also be able to trade directly with them. Slavery was really slavery as we would picture it, like in the context of the southern United States or the Caribbean or the other places in the modern times of chattel slavery, was not common at all in Western Europe for many centuries before the 1490s. Slavery was de facto and even de jure abolished over most of the continent. Serfdom existed, but that was a very different institution than chattel slavery that we'll get to know, and that will be much more common in the New World. So there's a real play between an idea that the Europeans of the 1490s, especially the church, was not comfortable with slavery, but they're kind of giving passes to Portugal and Spain because of their power, their political power. They're kind of giving them a pass on slavery. Now, our first major treaty between Portugal and Castile happens in this Treaty of Alcazobas in 1479. Please, anybody who's speaks Spanish or Portuguese, forgive me on that pronunciation. It accepted Isabella as the Queen of Castile, but also gave Portugal control of the Atlantic, the entire Atlantic trade. Portugal got control of the Guinea trade, Guinea of the West Africa, meaning Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands. Castile got the Canary Islands out of the deal, which actually turned out to be important. They did not view the Canary Islands as quite as important, but they will become important. It's especially going into Columbus's voyage of discovery. So we know a little bit about Columbus already, but his long story short, I'll summarize it really quickly. Columbus was a Genoese. There's actually some controversy whether he might have been from the northeastern corner of Spain, but we don't really need to get into this. The big thing is that he's an outsider to Castile and Aragon. He was not a noble or anything like that, and he made his name as sailing in the what we might in 1494 call the North Atlantic, the areas around northern France and Ireland and the coasts of Spain and Portugal. He was a sailor, and so he knew a lot about sailing. Columbus tried to convince John the Navigator or King João to finance his idea to sail west to reach the Indies. João put it before his plan, before his council of advisors, that this was like the brain trust of Europe. He had every scientific mind in the Western world was on this council of advisors, and they rejected the plan. To them, the plan had several serious flaws. And one thing I should note is in 1494, nobody anybody who knew anything about navigation or the sciences thought that the earth was flat. And nobody thought this, and nobody had really thought this for centuries and even millennia. Philosophers, scientists, theologians, they knew that the earth was round since Greek times. It's really a modern myth that the medievals, quote unquote, thought that the earth was flat. It was really a piece of anti-Catholic mythology that was created in the 1800s. One of the key people was the guy who wrote The Headless Horseman and Rip Van Winkle. Washington Irving, he wrote a book that he sold as a nonfiction book about the history of medieval Europe that was, I think he may have written it originally as a fiction book, but people took it as nonfiction. So he put, the medieval Spanish thought that Columbus, they thought he was going to sail over the edge of the world and over the edge of if you picture the earth as a dinner plate, and all this stuff that he put in this book, it was all not true. Nobody thought that in the medieval times, like hardcore, like Dark Ages, you go back, the Romans, the Greeks, nobody thought that. But here's what the flaws were in Columbus's plan. There were two competing theories on the circumference of the Earth based on ancient Greek calculations. These are Greek calculations that go to the times even well before the birth of Christ in the BC times. One theory was put forward by a Greek named Posidonius, and he approximated that the Earth was about 18,000 miles or 29,000 kilometers in circumference. Then there was another philosopher, Aristophanes, who he had a range. Based on his calculations, he's thinking that it was somewhere between 24,000 and 29,000 miles or 38 to 46,000 kilometers. Now, for the people at home who know this fact, I did not. I had to look it up myself. The actual circumference of the Earth is approximately 25,000 miles or 40,000 kilometers in circumference. And now a word from our sponsors.
As you mentioned, folks weren't really debating if the world was flat or not. The question is, how large was the globe? And that's where mistakes were made, and even by Columbus.
Yeah, so even though the Aristophanes number was much closer to the actual, for a variety of reasons, it was a more commonly held theory that Posidonius's number was the more accurate, and that's the number that Columbus went with. Most people thought that the islands that they called Cipangu and Cathay, which is Cipangu is modern day Japan and Cathay is more or less Hong Kong. What they thought, those islands couldn't be that far because they knew the Azores were pretty far away from Spain and Portugal. So how much further could Cathay be based on if the Earth was only 18,000 miles in circumference? And they went on with another idea that maybe what they called the Ocean Sea, which is the Atlantic Ocean. Hey, there's all these islands, the Madeiras, the Cape Verde Islands, the Azores. Maybe it's just dotted along the way so you can just island hop, boom, 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 boom. Next thing you know, you're in Cipangu or Cathay. Some experts speculated that now, even at this time in the 1480s, 1490s, some scholars have speculated that the Ocean Sea was massive, even getting pretty close to the estimate of the distance between Lisbon, Portugal, and China. Now, they didn't know what was in between the continents of North and South America, so they thought that that was maybe an entire just ocean. So it would be insanity to try and sail directly from Lisbon over all those thousands of miles or kilometers to get to the Indies or to Japan or China. Now, Columbus, he put together his proposal, and he's what you might call doing was he was massaging the data. He took the lowest estimate circumference of the Earth. He took the estimation of longitude, they didn't have a great way to estimate longitude. They basically couldn't, but he took the narrowest estimate. Like every single estimate that he made, he grossly underestimated to make it look like it was just a quick hop and jump over to get to the other side of the planet. He also, Columbus, he was sort of like a modern day tech startup. He wanted the government to foot the bill for his private enterprise. He basically wanted to set a situation where if he failed, he didn't lose anything. And if he was successful, he would reap most of the profits. In a way, you could say that maybe he felt like he was taking all the risk in there, maybe like personally with his life, his risk, but financially, he wasn't going to be taking any risk whatsoever in this transaction. Portugal completely rejects this, and then Columbus went to Spain and really worked hard to ingratiate himself with Isabella and Ferdinand. He was with them when Granada fell, and now at this point in 1492, they're flush with cash. They don't have this thorn in their side of the Emirate of Granada. They have most of the peninsula united between them. They're ready to finance this voyage. And for them, it's a good deal. It gets them involved in discovery. They give Columbus 3 mediocre ships, nothing special. It's not like they're giving him the most high-tech equipment. If Columbus goes and he comes back, maybe they have a ship or two to play against Joao. If he doesn't, who cares? He's gone. They've lost 3 ships, and that's that.
So some of our listeners are probably asking themselves, why aren't they talking about the French or the English or the Dutch? But the key thing to understand is that in 1492 and the early 1490s, the English and French and Dutch and other countries aren't really part of this age of discovery. It's mostly Portugal, and now Spain is getting into the game with Christopher Columbus. Columbus sails successfully and explores new territories, and that brings us up to the treaty that will basically divvy up all of these lands amongst these 2 emerging superpowers from the Iberian Peninsula. The treaty was signed in 1494. Who was it negotiated amongst, and who signed the treaty?
The treaty was signed between Spain and Portugal. Technically, the people who are responsible for that were the kings and queens of each of those kingdoms. So Columbus, when he comes back, we don't know what Columbus really thought that he discovered. He went pretty much to his grave thinking that he had discovered the Indies. Most scholars in Europe at the time didn't think that he actually did get to India or Cathay or Chipangu or anything like that. But what they're really waiting for is when Columbus comes back from his second journey, they're waiting for more information to come in. The Portuguese and the Spanish are waiting. How far does he go? How many leagues does he travel? What can he figure out about longitude? What lands has he discovered? As soon as Columbus returns with all this new information, these previous treaties and bulls, like the Treaty of Alcaçovas, they were in tatters. Was this new land area part of Portugal's area of exclusive exploitation? Ferdinand and Isabella, they had to act really quickly. So what do? They go directly to their dear old friend, Pope Alexander the Sixth. He's the Pope now. They were able to get Alexander to issue a series of papal bulls, and the most important one was called Inter Caetera, which was signed on May 3rd in 1493, and then an addendum to that bull, which was actually written in the summer of 1493, but was backdated to May 4th of 1493, so one day after the original Inter Caetera was signed. This new bull of Inter Caetera granted Spain a monopoly over their newly discovered lands. Initially, though, Columbus's discoveries didn't look very promising. He didn't really find a ton of gold or silver in the Caribbean, just tiny amounts. The spices and flora and fauna that he brought back were not the pepper and cumin and cardamom, etc., like those types of things that people were really excited. As a matter of fact, like what we call chili peppers, like habaneros and jalapenos, they were named peppers. They were called peppers by Columbus as a marketing ploy because they were spicy and it gave him something to come home. And he was like, oh, look at this new kind of pepper I found. Even though they're completely unrelated to pepper, as in the black pepper. So this Inter Caetera papal bull created a new line of demarcation between Spain's area of control and the Portuguese line of control. As a matter of fact, these papal bulls didn't even mention Portugal. You would only know that they were talking about Portugal through inference. They affirmed the doctrine of the right to first discovery. So that really helped Portugal too. So the Spanish couldn't lay claim to something that the Portuguese had discovered, and the Portuguese couldn't lay claim to something that, say, the Spanish discovered. But it also locked out all the other powers at the time: the French, the Holy Roman Empire, the English. And these are all Catholic countries at this point. You don't have France that has a huge Huguenot contingency. You don't have England that turns into a Protestant country. They're all Catholic, and it completely cuts them out of this whole new age of discovery under the threat of excommunication.
The attitude towards these papal bulls and the treaty that other governments had was expressed by Francis, the King of France, who declared, "The sun shines for me as it does for others. I would very much like to see the clause of Adam's will by which I should be denied my share of the world."
I think that's a great quote because it shows the thought at that time. You've got to put your mind, England and France in the 1400s had just ended the devastating 100 Years' War. I can't think, it was earlier in the 1400s. I don't know the precise date. I think it was maybe even as late as the 1450s, but in medieval times, you're talking decades, just a few decades. They're totally exhausted. Their economies are exhausted. Based on the 100 Years' War, England had a few other internal wars based on that. So they're really weakened and they don't have a lot of extra resources to throw into discovery. So England tries a couple of early voyages of discovery that don't really go anywhere. France has a couple of early ones. I'm talking like in the early 1500s that don't lead to very much. And they're still at this time, they're really under this threat of excommunication. And the threat of excommunication brings with them the threat of being not only cut out of the spiritual trade of Europe, but also the political trade of Europe.
Let's get back to the treaty and look at it from a technical point of view. How was the world, or the known world, divided by this treaty that was signed by representatives of Portugal and Spain?
The original 1493 line from Inter Caetera made the line 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. What they said was the 46th degree longitude. Problem was, they didn't really precisely know what a degree of longitude was. So there was a lot of flex in what that is. 100 leagues would have been approximately 555, if you want to be precise, kilometers, or about 350-ish miles west of the Cape Verde Islands.
Okay, Steve, so now let's get into the details and the nitty-gritty of the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Okay, so that was signed in June 7th of 1494. The negotiations had started earlier in the spring of 1494, and they are waiting to learn what had occurred during Columbus's second voyage. Really, at this point in 1494, they're waiting with bated breath about what Columbus is learning from his second voyage. The Portuguese, they were bargaining from a bad position. The Pope was against them, and they weren't strong enough militarily to take on Spain if it came to that point. The Treaty of Tordesillas, it moved the demarcation line a few hundred miles west of the Inter Caetera line. The Treaty of Tordesillas was affirmed by a papal bull, A qua pro bono pacis, which that didn't get signed until about a decade later in 1506. But that moved the line, like I said, further west about 900 miles. Portugal claimed that they needed that extra breathing space to get around to their new African and Indian holdings. So they didn't want to say, oh, wait, we accidentally went into the Spanish territory and, be under the threat of excommunication or be considered pirates so that Spain could claim their ships. That's at least their negotiating position. It's possible, though, that João or John II was trying to get the best deal he could at that conference. And João may have, sandbagged or held back on some information at the conference to protect the new Brazil discovery. Brazil wasn't officially discovered until about 1500. But so it's a possibility that they knew about Brazil as early as then and wanted to get the line moved over as far as they could so that that little section of South America could be claimed by them at a later point. But like I said, João was not in a great position at that conference, and he was also had the worry that he might be invaded by Castile and Aragon. So through this Treaty of Tordesillas, he was able to protect the Spice Islands, Malacca, India, and their African trade, which at least in the 1490s was exponentially more lucrative than what the Spanish trade was with the West Indies. So like what the Portuguese held in real Indies in India and in Indonesia was just a much better thing for them economically. So he wanted to do everything that he could do to protect that.
Portugal and Spain seem to have negotiated and signed the treaty without consulting the Pope. Why do some call the resulting line the papal line of demarcation?
Like we had said earlier, the various papal bulls were actually more important than the treaty itself. The bulls were what made those treaties legal and enforceable. So they needed the Pope's stamp of approval to make a treaty official. It is called the papal demarcation because the papal bulls are what gave that power, that treaty legitimacy. Thus, that series of papal bulls, including Inter Caetera in 1493 and then the one done by Julius II, are really what got the whole ball rolling of an idea of a demarcation line.
A pope did eventually ratify the treaty. Let's talk a bit about that pope, the famous Pope Julius II.
So yeah, he's another one of the great popes. He was his name previous to Pope Julius II was Giuliano della Rovere, and he was from the famous della Rovere family of Italy. He was the great warrior pope, and he fought wars all over central Italy to secure his secular domains of the papal states. So his real focus was never on what was going on much outside of his really narrow focus on central Italy. That was his main focus.
Wasn't he also Michelangelo's pope that commissioned him to do the Sistine Chapel? And the movie with Charlton Heston, Julius was the pope played by Rex Harrison, based on a famous book, and the movie was a big hit. It's a really good movie. It's a great movie. Charlton Heston in The Agony and Ecstasy. That was a big movie at the time, based on a big book. Charlton Heston, Rex Harrison. It's all about the painting of the Sistine Chapel, and it's the battle of wills between Michelangelo, a young Michelangelo, and Pope Julius II, who is the warrior pope, and we see him fighting battles at the beginning of the movie. When and why did Pope Julius ratify this treaty?
So that's a really good question. There's not a ton of information on that. Pope Julius did put his seal of approval on the treaty, like we said, with the A quae pro bono pacis in 1506. The thing was, Julius really wasn't involved in Spanish and Portuguese politics like Alexander VI was. The Portuguese and the Spanish were good with the treaty, and it didn't really remarkably change the balance of power between the two from that 1493 treaty. But there must have been some reason that they wanted to have it officially sanctioned by him. I'm kind of spitballing here because I didn't find a great answer. The end of Alexander's life there was a lot of internal conflict there. Then Julius has a lot of problems he's dealing with. So it may have just taken time for this kind of not a huge change to the treaty to just work its way through the bureaucracy. It wasn't there wasn't a big political intrigue or something really meaty or juicy like that for why Julius held out so long or why it took so long to get the official bull to legally recognize the treaty. It could have been these other considerations that were going on.
I know that Portugal and Spain largely respected the treaty, but the other European powers, as you alluded to, and indigenous nations, however, did not sign the treaty and generally ignored it.
France was not in a great position, and England weren't in great positions to exploit or to get into the voyages of discovery. They had to find some Italian or Genoese navigators, and they did, and they made some discoveries early on, but they weren't really able to make a lot out of these discoveries. And as far as the Holy Roman Empire goes, or went at that time, it was really a patchwork of individual states. So they didn't really have the ability to garner a ton of resources to set sail. And they were mostly a land-based empire to begin with. So these major powers really weren't in a good spot to take on Portugal and Spain, who had such an early head start on them because they were the early adopters, as it were.
So that begs the question, how was the treaty enforced? Because basically with Jacques Cartier and the French, they were thumbing their nose at the treaty. And then John Cabot and the British, they were thumbing their nose at the treaty. And basically the next decades, the other European countries were saying, we don't care about your treaty.
I think I think Denmark they never gave up the claim to Greenland.
Okay.
They now, if they had an official reaction, probably nobody particularly cared what Denmark had to say about it in the 1490s or the 1500s. But I don't think they ever gave up claim. And that comes up more so later, I think, with the French and the English than it does with the Treaty of Tordesillas, because really by the time Martin Luther and the Reformation come, then that completely changes, and none of them really care or respect the Treaty of Tordesillas as far as it goes with excommunication. The Protestant Reformation, that really took a lot of the sting out of that excommunication idea. So we start to see that France and every other country in Europe that wasn't involved in the treaty, they start to care less and less about the treaty. The indigenous people of North and South America, they still have a problem with this treaty to this day. And obviously they didn't appreciate their lands getting carved up by two countries on the other side of the planet. We also have the issue of the Norse claims, really Denmark, that had a claim to particularly Greenland. Now, we all know from Mark's podcast about the discoveries by the Vikings much earlier, but Greenland comes into the play because Greenland wasn't officially abandoned until sometime in the mid 1400s. Some new archaeology has come up that shows that climate change may have played a part into Greenland's colony being not wiped out, but it's sort of fading out. But one thing that's interesting and that ties us all back together is some of the Spanish and the Portuguese conquests, such as the Central Atlantic Islands, the Madeiras, the Azores, etc., and their conquests into Africa seriously cut into the Greenland trade on ivory. The Greenlanders made most of their money by trading walrus ivory to Europe. The Spanish and the Portuguese at this time made big inroads into being able to trade the much cheaper and more abundant elephant ivory. So in a way, it could have, if they hadn't started to make these inroads into trade into Africa, you may have seen a situation where the Greenlander colonies did carry on. That's hard to say, but Greenland would have definitely come into a lot more conflict if Spanish and Portuguese trade hadn't really devastated their economy. Then the Protestant Reformation comes, of which Denmark fully embraced. It sort of takes Denmark completely out of the equation, but they had a legitimate claim to these areas that were new discoveries. I mean, look at Vinland and Labrador, and even as far south as Maine. Had they stayed Catholic, Denmark, they had the rights of first discovery to those lands.
What does the Portuguese-speaking modern nation of Brazil owe to this late 15th century document?
Well, it's interesting that line, the second line, like we said, it bumped over the papal line of demarcation enough that it just sliced through the corner of Brazil. So that gave the Portuguese an inroad into colonizing Brazil, which would have really, under Intercaetera line, but under almost most of the circumstances, all of North and South America are solidly inside of the Spanish realm of control. But that little slice of the later Treaty of Tordesillas line gave Portugal legitimate claim to that part of South America. And there's some other, it doesn't really play into North American history, but that's the reason why the Spanish could lay claim to the Philippines, because that line of demarcation didn't just cut through the Western hemisphere, it goes all the way through the entire north-south circumference of the planet. So places that would normally be completely under what you would think should be under the Portuguese's area of control, like the Philippines, actually are under Spain's.
Where in Spain is Tordesillas located?
Tordesillas is just outside of the city of Valladolid, which may not be on everybody's radar, but it's the key point to Tordesillas is it wasn't terribly far from Portugal. It was really fairly much what you would say on the border, a couple of miles inside of the border from Portugal.
Is that why the treaty was signed in that town?
Yeah, it really kind of neutral ground, so to speak, so that, they're still, you're talking about medieval times at this point. They could play some dirty politics. So it was a way to keep everybody honest on where they were having these negotiations.
Where are the originals of the treaty kept?
One copy's kept in the National Archives of Portugal in Lisbon, the Arquivo Nacional Torre do Tombo. That's their national archives. And then the other copy is in the Arquivo General de Indias, the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain. This is a place that if anybody out there is really interested in the discoveries of the New World, the Archive of the Indies in Seville is absolutely loaded to the gills with incredibly important documents, including documents. I think it holds all of Columbus's documents, Cortez's documents, the writer Cervantes. They're all in there.
Well, that's actually where Christopher Columbus is buried, or part of him anyway.
Yeah. Seville became a really important launching point for these voyages of the Spanish. I'd love to get into that archive. I mean, obviously they're never going to let me go and thumb through the treaty or Columbus's originals, but I'm sure they have a place where regular people can go through and look.
Have you ever been to Spain or Portugal?
Believe it or not, my family, we had been planning for a year to go on essentially a road trip through Portugal and Spain starting the second week of April in 2020. We were going to fly to Lisbon, visit some friends there. We were going to visit some of the key launching points of the Voyage of Discovery. We were going to stay in this part of Portugal called the Algarve, which actually, Prince John II spent a lot of his time in this area. Then we were going to drive through the great towns of southern Andalusia, Cadiz, Huelva and stay in Seville and then drive north and pass through Badajoz, where one of the precursor conferences that one of the conferences that was after the Treaty of Tordesillas that helped smooth out a couple of the other details of the Treaty of Tordesillas was held in Badajoz. That trip got completely wiped out by the corona lockdowns of 2020. And at this point, we don't have any plans to go back, but hopefully when all of this is over, I definitely like to go. Like I said, we have friends that we were going to visit there, but hopefully it'll happen soon.
I've been to Spain and Portugal. I'm quite fond of Portuguese fado. It's a type of folk music characterized by mournful tunes and lyrics. How about the home of the Pope, Steve? Have you ever visited Rome? And if so, when were you last in Vatican City?
The last time I had a chance to visit Rome was in 2004, which is a shame. I'd like to go back. And that was another nice, even before, was podcasting even invented in 2004? I'm not sure it was.
I don't think so, no.
But we stayed in a hotel that the parking lot of this hotel backed up to the walls of the Vatican. So that was really cool. So we went and did all the Vatican museums. Rome's one of those places you could stay there for years and never get a good grasp. Have you traveled to Rome?
I visited Rome for the Great Jubilee in February 2000 at the start of the second millennium celebrations when Pope John Paul's health was visibly in decline. I entered St. Peter's Basilica through the Holy Door. Most of the time, the Holy Door is cemented shut. On the occasion of the Jubilee year, the Pope unsealed the door as a symbol of opening the door of grace. Pilgrims visiting to gain the Jubilee indulgence entered the Basilica through this special door, and so did I. Throughout most of the Jubilee year, long lines were queued up to enter the Holy Door. Rome is the eternal city, and I guess I'm eternally grateful that I was able to spend some time there in the year 2000.
We toured the Vatican museums. That museum trip winds up letting you off. Your last stop is at the Sistine Chapel. Honestly, by the time you wait in line to get into the Vatican museums and you walk through miles and miles of just the most amazing art you've ever seen in your life, you're almost completely, you're sensory overload by the time you get to the Sistine Chapel. And I think that that's probably Rome in a nutshell, is that you have to spend as much time there as you possibly can, because the whole place, it's history overload, it's sensory overload, it's everything, culture overload.
Well, I guess this is a fitting place to end today's discussion. It's been really interesting, and I really enjoyed spending time with you, Steve. Thank you for granting me the honor and privilege of sharing your wonderful audience. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so very appreciative that you thought of having me on to talk about this fascinating subject. I appreciate getting a chance to talk with your audience, and you'll be hearing from the both of us soon.
Wonderful.